Okay. For some reason, our live broadcast stopped, and I'm starting it again.
Okay.
Um, can I ask you,
Hmm.
just for in case somebody missed it?
Oh
So I'm
boy.
online today with Suzanne van Hove, a good old friend of 15 years. Um, she is the convener of one of the ISO work groups, and we've started talking about what a standard is, first of all. So, Suzanne, if you can maybe just quickly recap that little bit for us.
Okay, so first of all, a standard is a group of typically requirements that is the minimal and consensus based of requirements that will allow an outcome to occur. So in my case, within JCT1, SC40, WG2, which is around service management, the standard ISO IEC 20000 is our set of minimal requirements that we use to create a service management system.
Okay.
Um, so there's the standard. Okay.
Okay. And the operative word is a management system.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about the service, it's about the way that you manage the delivery of the service.
Correct. Correct. So there's another section within ISO that talks about management system standards, and there's about 60, depends on how you count, 60 to 80 management system standards that cover a variety of different topics. So it could be quality. So people have heard about 9001, ISO
Mhm.
9001, which is a quality management system. You may have heard about 27001, which is an information security management system. So telling you how to manage the delivery of IT functionality, but keeping in mind security and privacy of information. We have an environmental management system. We have an asset management system. So they're all over the ISO world, I guess I should say, because they go up into medical devices, they go into tourism, and a lot of
Mm.
different areas. But it's how to
Occupational health and
manage.
safety, food safety, all
Yes,
kinds of stuff like
yes,
that.
yes, exactly.
Uh,
Water,
environment.
etc. Yes.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so it is then fair to say that if you want a baseline for
Mm-hmm.
doing good IT service management, 20,000 is it.
That's it. You're exactly right.
Okay,
Um,
so
yep.
let me be a little bit facetious. So I
Okay.
find it always really amusing when people say to me, um, we want you to come and talk to us about ISO 20,000 or 27,000 or whatever. Um, and my response is then, why? Just now, because we want to be, yeah, it's best practice and we want to be best. And I go, I don't know if the baseline is best. You won't suck at it if you do that stuff, but maybe that's where you need to start. So let's start there and build it from there. Would you
Okay.
agree with that statement?
I would. It's the minimal set, and it's ubiquitous. It's what the multitude of national bodies have agreed to. But those requirements, so if we are in a perfect world, those requirements are great, but an organization is not a perfect world.
Yeah.
So you do have to tailor those requirements to fit your organization, your culture, your strategy, but to still meet the requirement, but meet it in the requirement of your organization.
Yeah.
So if you don't put the appropriate resources toward a requirement, you may be able to say, hey, tick in the box, but you may not be able to say, wow, we've done this as most efficiently and effectively as we possibly can. Because you could have deployed that requirement in such a convoluted way that you may be losing resources or wasting resources, something along that line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if we compare that with something like a framework, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
where we're trying to describe the world,
Right.
um, and I think for me the differentiator is so this is the next thing that I chuckle about is we want to be ITIL compliant.
Oh God. Yeah.
Because when you write best practices, you write like that,
Mm-hmm.
you diverge. When you write standards, you converge.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a ton of things that we see in these two different, let's say, outflows of best practice.
Right.
That's actually sort of contradictory.
Mm-hmm.
Not in terms of content, but in terms of scope, I suppose, and applicability. Yes, would you
Mm-hmm.
agree with that
Yeah.
statement?
Totally agree. Yeah. It used to always be, 15 years ago when we met, it was about best practice. And 5 years prior to that, it was always, this is best practice, this best practice. And as service management evolved, IDLE stepped up and said, oh, no, we don't want to talk about best practices anymore. We want to talk about good practices. And I'm like, oh, my goodness, what are we doing here? And then trying to understand the logic behind best to good to what somebody deploys. And it goes back to the organization. IDLE has for numerous years, prior to IDLE 4, I'm going to say, has been very, very almost prescriptive in how they describe the various processes. And I'm saying that specifically because I'm talking before IDLE 4.
Yes.
And folks had trouble with it. When I first was introduced to IDLE, I learned very quickly that you need to read the white space. So you had to be able to look at what was being said, which was all good information, but you had to see between the lines to truly understand it, between the words. And otherwise it became overwhelming. It was just truly overwhelming. So I actually found IDLE first and then found ISO 20000 afterward. And it was one of those aha moments that said, oh my gosh, here is the actual, this is what you need. And once I understood what a standard was telling me, saying this has been agreed among, the nation's experts that participate in this group, that this is the minimal set of requirements. And then you could take those requirements and apply them to your organization and apply the guidance that was in ITIL or COBIT or any other framework. And at the time, it was just basically ITIL and COBIT, and make sure that it fit the purpose of your organization. So that fit for purpose. So in other words, you were taking the best practice and saying, let me modify it to fit my organization. And now it was a best practice for my organization. So you went from best to good to best, but you had to understand the context of where you were applying best and good.
Yes.
So, so right now, I think all of the now I'm not going to say standards, but methodologies, frameworks, descriptors, whatever there might be out there, they're all talking goodness. They're all saying these are really good things. And then how you apply them in your organization, you're taking something that has some sort of agreement out there by whom I don't know, because I'm only saying methodologies and frameworks. I'm not saying standards, but methodologies and frameworks. And I'm taking that goodness and making it the best for me, which now I've taken from good to best practice for that organization. International standards, I truly believe that is at the absolute minimum, and they're saying that minimum should be found, or in an international standard, it shall be found in the organization if they're going to go for certification. So that is then by default a best practice. Now, how the organization achieves that standard or that requirement, it's up to the organization. The auditor needs to be able to say, okay, here's the requirement. Here's how they're doing it. Does it match? Absolutely, tick in the box.
Okay, and I think that's the important thing here, is that when we define standards, we don't define them as this is how you do it. We define them as this is what you need to achieve.
You just
did it. Correct?
Yes, you just said it. The standard is telling you the what. The how is not in the requirements document. So in terms of ISO 20000, part 1, so ISO 20000-1 is the set of requirements for a service management system. ISO 20000-2 is a guidance document that tells you a little bit more of the how. We worked very, very hard in 20,000 Part 1 to make sure there was no how statements. It needed to be generic, and it needed to just be the what, and leaving it up to the organization to pick and pull from other guidance, be it 20,000 Part 2, be it IDLE, be it COBIT, be it, any other framework out there, IT for IT, whatever it might be, and say, oh, those things make sense to me. This is how I'm going to deploy this requirement that is found in 20,000 Part 1. And I've documented it so when the auditor comes in, we can say, here's the requirement, here's the evidence, great, we've met it.
Okay, so that then brings us to another thing that we need to bear in mind, is that you said that it's a family of standards, and some of the standards are normative and others are not. What does that mean?
Okay, this is a question that I think behooves people who have been in the ISO community for. It's like, okay, is that a normative reference or is that an informative reference? Is it not? So normative means it's mandatory. I mean, that's the best way I can say. So if it's a normative reference, you have to comply to what those requirements are. So we might have a document that normatively references another standard, which means, hey, you need to know what's in the other standard to be able to successfully fulfill this standard. And then the opposite of normative is informative. And so we usually find that normative, informative, not only in referencing documents, but also in annexes. So appendices to the requirements or the body of the standard, where you have a normative annex or an informative one. An informative one is basically an example. It's just saying, hey, this is for your information. This is how we see it being applied, blah, blah, blah. However you want to do it is up to you. Here's some additional information that is not going to be a requirement, and it is not normative, but it's describing, I guess, is the best way.
So that comes a little bit closer to what frameworks then may be.
Yes, yes.
So here are some ideas. You don't have to do it, but it's a bloody good idea. Yeah.
Right. So for example, we have, let's just take one of the parts that we have. So Part 5, which is implementation guidance, short title. It's not the complete title, but implementation guidance. And in the back of Part 5, in the annexes, we have some comparison tables. So these are informative, saying, hey, if you're doing this, here is a link to something else that may help you understand. Or we might compare definitions of two terms from different standards. One term may define risk one way, another standard may define risk a slightly different way. And we need to understand, why are they different? And what does that mean for me as an organization that may be deploying one of those standards? So those types of things. So yeah, it's examples. It's very specific examples, but they are examples. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the informative standards in your specific work group. Which are the hot topics at the moment?
The hot topics, I'm going to say, are the ones that are currently being worked on. So Part 14, which is around SIAM, and then Part 15, which is still out for national body voting and acceptance that we can move forward with that document, is agile and DevOps. So how can you deploy a service management system utilizing the principles and guidance from agile and DevOps? We know, and I'll just stay on that one for a second, because we know it's such a hot topic that people will look at 20,000 and say, oh my God, that's so old. Why are you doing it? And it's like, it's not old, and it doesn't have to be, traditionally clunky and filled with overhead and whatever. Very easily can we adapt the requirements for a service management system to fit within an agile environment, or to utilize DevOps principles. Very simple, but getting through that predetermined or preconceived notion that it can't be done, that is incredibly frustrating. But it is a level of communication. So that's Part 15. Hopefully, and the voting closes on that in the next 9 days, I believe. So it's been out for vote for over 8 weeks. So we should know that we're moving forward in the next 9 or 10 days.
And I really hope that we do.
Yeah.
So when the broadcast didn't start, Suzanne just said that this work group is most probably one of the most active ISO work groups out there. And I can attest to that because I've got mail in my inbox every single day.
Yeah, that's my retirement activity, is sending an email.
And I must also admit that I'm really a bad contributor at the moment.
I'll get you when I need you. So it's okay. You know that you're on my radar.
Yeah. So,
but let me talk a little bit about this agile and DevOps piece, just a little bit more, because I want to give kudos to JCT1, which is the overarching committee, that it's a joint task group for or technical committee, joint technical committee, if I do the acronym correctly, that includes ISO as well as IEC. And
IEC is, for those who don't know,
the International Electrical Technical Committee. I hope I did it right. So, but it does more of telecom and associated areas. And I'm sorry that I'm not more specific, but that's the best I can do. So this is really, JCT1 is the technical committee for the standards community. And so there is a number of subcommittees within there that are based on, software, system engineering, AI, and they continue to grow. So IoT, I mean, they just continue to grow. Well, SC40 is one of those committees within JCT1. But within SC7, which is the system and software engineering, something, title isn't exactly correct, and I apologize for that. They've kicked off about a year ago within SC7 WG29. So work group 29, which is around agile and DevOps. And so, when they first did this, is quite confusing. And it's like, how do you standardize agility? That just doesn't make sense, right? But at the same time, people say agile, it means, and the preconceived notion says, oh, I don't have to have any process. I don't have to have any direction. I can just do whatever the hell I want. Well, no, you can't, because we've all learned that process is very efficient. It just means that let's make the process that we're doing expedited, very, minimalistic, simple to follow. And it's like, hello, that's describing a standard. So what we want to do, and what we have done, is that once we get part 15 approved from our national body side, is that we've already talked to SC7 WG29 and saying, look, we want to cooperate and collaborate with you in coming up with how does a service management system and agile and DevOps principles interleave? How do they come together so that we get the benefit from both? And I think that's very, very important. And I think it's very important to the community out there, as they try to manage, how many organizations did you hear about when Agile and DevOps all of a sudden became the buzzword bingo, and people said, oh, I'm dropping idle and I'm just going to be an Agile shop. And I'm like, no, you can't do that. Yeah, it's not going to work, and by the way, every iteration that you have in an agile process is really a mini change process. That's all it is. Yeah. And until you understand that, I mean, I realize there's subtleties and whatnot, but keeping it a big picture, they really go together. It's like peanut butter and jelly. They go together, Yeah.
And I think the thing that people need to understand is, because it's something like ISO 20000-1 at least, talks about outcomes a service provider need to achieve for the benefit of their customer, and also internal outcomes to get there. Right. the how can be 100% agile or DevOps.
Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. It could be
the,
100% idle or COBIT. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
or your own thing.
Right.
There's nothing that says that your way of getting to those outcomes needs to be in anybody else's book.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I
I
just wish
think,
all auditors would see it that way also.
yeah, I was just going to bring up our friends, the auditors. The biggest thing that if you do follow a service management system and you do want the certification, the ISO certification, you have to provide the evidence for the auditor. So, it really doesn't matter how you achieve the requirement. You just have to demonstrate that you have achieved the requirement in a manner that's understandable by the auditor. So you would be working with the auditing body as you go through and prepare for, either that initial audit or a surveillance audit, and make sure that the evidence that you're providing is understandable and that the auditor is prepared to see it at the level that it needs to be seen and interpret it at the level that it needs to be interpreted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I've worked with some brilliant auditors, and I've worked with some tick box auditors also.
Right.
And it's with that last group that I'm going to see difficulties coming with agile and DevOps.
Exactly. Exactly. And this is another thing that's kind of wonderful about WG2 is that we have several auditors in the group that, we constantly go back and forth to them. They're very critical to us and how we define the various documents and products that we produce, and saying, okay, from an auditing perspective, where's the road bump or the speed block or the pothole, whatever you want to call it. What do we have to prepare? And in fact, that we do have part 6 in the 20,000 series that does talk about auditing, helping auditors to be prepared and do whatever. So we've tried very hard to have that breadth within the work group, in our experts, that represents of how an organization is facing their commercial entities, to make sure that we are considering the full scope and the full gamut of what could happen, and that we're prepared for it.
Yeah. So that assumingly if 15 goes ahead, then 6 needs to be rewritten also or updated.
Well, we'll see. It brings a good point. So we've just done a systematic review on part 6. So within the ISO community, all documents have to be reviewed within a 5-year period. So ISO takes the data publication and attaches, adds 5 years to it and says, okay, a systematic review must occur by X date. And it says, quite frankly, or quite clearly in the directives, which is the rules that we have to apply by, that yes, a systematic review has to happen every 5 years, but an entity could ask for a systematic review prior to the 5 years. So right now we're preparing part 1, preparing a recommendation for part 1, because it's coming up on its 5-year anniversary. So it was released in 2018. It's getting ready for its 5-year systematic review. And the editor, Linda Cooper, and team have been working very, very hard and very robustly, doing surveys, questionnaires, talking to customers, clients, experts, auditors, etc., saying what is in that document that may need to change. Do we need to add things? Do we need to do whatever? Because we're going to write a recommendation that will be attached to the ISO ballot that says the experts in WG2 who own this document recommend that that part 1 either be confirmed, be revised, have a minor revise, amended, withdrawn, something along that line. Those are our choices within the directives. And so part 6 just went through that process. And the editor there, Finbar Callan out of BSI, and his team included an auditor from BSI as well, who's a very extensive, excellent auditor, as well as the editor for part 1 and Linda Cooper. They looked at part 6 and said, okay, let's look at this. Is there anything that needs to change? Is it still conformant to the needs that we have today? And it came back with a recommendation. Yes, it is. So with part 15, when it comes in, we'll look at how we've written part 6 and say, are there changes that need to be addressed in part 6 that will help part 15? You know, the people who take on to part 15. So there is a process. We know that it's there. But again, we wrote part 6, or I should say Finbar and team wrote part 6 to pretty much be bulletproof. Trying to make it as I'm not going to say generic, but as future-proofed as possible. So looking at it and saying, hey, an audit is always going to be an audit, and it's going to have these things. And we'll look at it once part 15, make sure that it's confirmed, and then we get it written and then published. Then we'll look at part 6. So
okay.
Right.
And the SIAM one is also an interesting one for me, because very few organizations these days cannot benefit from a service integrator role.
Yeah.
So that's great. So just maybe a little bit. How do ideas land up on the radar?
They come from a lot of different places. I take it upon myself, and probably unnecessarily so, to try to think about the future and bring in ideas. So every work group will meet at least once a year as a unit in a plenary session. Most groups will also have an interim session or a second plenary. We've played with the idea in SC40 to have 2 plenaries. A plenary means that you can vote, that national bodies need to be in place, and that there are resolutions that we can vote on which direct where we're going. So that ongoing business plan is to the forefront. So part of my role I've taken on as the convener is to bring in ideas, things that I've heard in the service management community, and just toss them out there and say, hey guys, what do you think? Is this something that we should look at? And right now we're also, and in doing that, what I'll do as a convener is create task groups on ideas that, when you go fishing and you use a bobber, the little telltale that sits on top of the water, and when a fish starts nibbling at the bait, the bobber will bob up and down. And so that's what I do. I throw out an idea and see if we get a hit, and then we'll create a task group. And then, 5, 6 to 8, 10 people or whatever will join in that task group and say, okay, you have 6 months, come up with an idea and present it at our next meeting and say, this is what we want to do, something along that line. So we've had education come up, and that's been a very hot topic. It's like, how do we get information out within service management? Because I've seen service management go from being something that's absolutely the best thing ever to now where it's almost looked at as a 4-letter word. We don't want to talk about service management. It's like, oh my God, that is like the worst thing that we ever want to do. And I'm like, guys, everything's service. We need to manage it. What's the problem? So we're starting to think and saying, hey, is education, and that doesn't mean certification. It means education as what should we be doing? Another one that has come up has been measurement, because as you've rightly said, part 1 has requirements, and you look at clause 9 and 10 and scattered throughout some of the other requirements, there is a requirement to measure, to show continual improvement, to have some sort of data, but we don't tell you what it is. Well, because we talk about the what, not the how. And in talking to our auditors, the auditors have come back and said, folks just don't know how to measure this requirement. And so we've come up with a measurement group where we did a year-long view of what's the impact of measurement to the SMS, what should we do, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to restart that task group the end of next month, again, with a recommendation going forward to our interim meeting, which we're having in Porto, Portugal in November, about do we need to write a document? Do we need to write a white paper? What do we need to do to help our consumers with the concept of measurement? So, I also look to the people in the group. And as we welcome 2, 3, 4 new members, in a biweekly basis, saying, hey, we really want your ideas. What is it that you need to see? And let's present that. And then we have one other way of doing this, is that we have 5 times a year, the secretary of SC40 WG2 came up with this, Dominique Boutet out of Canada. She came up and said, let's do a 20-20-20 meeting. And I'm like, okay, what the hell is that? And she said, 20 minutes, you talk about what's happening in ISO. 20 minutes, we have a topic, and 20 minutes, we decide what to do with that topic. And I'm like, wow, in 1 hour, we have a very fast moving, very informative meeting where we get 20, 30 people at a time. And it's the members who are presenting, not me, which I'm very happy about, because I run out of topics pretty quickly. And they're presenting a passion. And so that passion then can trigger, a task group and trigger a new idea. And that's where some of these new parts have come. So SIAM was one of those that was triggered. The link between Michelle Major Goldsmith, Claire Agater, and myself in that area. And I said, look, you guys, you want to have this as a standard? Do you want? And they said yes. So that's where it came from. Cool. And that's what we're working on.
Just a quick shout out. Peter, Simone, Doug, LinkedIn user. Sorry, I don't know what your name is. I haven't switched to the other platforms yet. Thanks for being here. Simone just says, wow, 2020 vision in 20 exclamation mark. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you guys for joining. I have no insight as who's out there, but thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see that you're there.
Yeah. So normally, most of the views of the videos are. Matthew says, "Okay, I'm also here. Hello, Matthew." Most of the views I actually get after the podcast is finished.
Yeah.
It seems like this is a good thing for people to do tomorrow morning when they go to the gym.
Right.
They start the podcast and they get onto a treadmill. And they know by the time it's finished, it's an hour.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a great way. In prep for this one, when I was trying to come up with a topic that you and I could talk about, I went through and I wrote down all the titles of all the podcasts that are out there on YouTube. And I was like, okay, maybe there's a way I can group them, or, somehow, and say, look at what service management is pointing to in the future because of the various topics that are coming through. And the funny thing is not to get off the topic of standards, because you can tell it's a passion. But the funny thing is that a lot of the topics that we've had have not been around, technologies, or, God forbid, if we hear the word digital transformation one more time, I think I could just, my head will split open. But it's been around actual management, which I love. It's the softer skills, and, how do I manage in an unmanageable world where nobody sees each other anymore, and those types of things. And I found those to be, most interesting and most predominant, is that people still need to learn in service management. The emphasis is on management of the service, which means you have to talk to people. And, so for so many years that we saw the decline of students in, IT programs, and finding out why is because they said there's no people aspect. Well, gee whiz, service management just screams that you have to be able to manage people. You have to understand, and you have to, manage expectations and everything else that goes with it. And these are skills that are not just immediately available in your brain. They need to be learned and massaged and, matured as you go through as a manager. So, good topics. So that's my sidebar.
Suzanne, Matthew just threw something out there. He said, so what about talking about skills?
With Sophia.
Seeing that he comes from the Sophia side. Yeah.
Right. Something, Matthew, I love you to pieces. And Sophia, I love that structure. And it, but it's been something that, apologies. It's been something that is, always to the forefront, but getting in my neck of the woods in the United States, and I know that you've been trying to work in this environment, to getting them to say, here's a resource that will actually help you develop jobs descriptions that are meaningful rather than having an analyst or a programmer. I mean, good Lord, you know, I was offered a service manager job that gave me an analyst title. And yet they wanted all of these certifications. They wanted my PhD. They wanted all this other stuff, but I was going to be an analyst. And I'm going, no. You don't understand what you're asking for, and you're not understanding what the requirements are. So big call out to Sophia. I think it's a wonderful, wonderful set of information. And as it continues to mature and add to that core information, to me, it's a no-brainer. But to get other people to understand it, at least in the United States or in my neck of the woods, it's been very difficult, and I hate that for you. So I'm very happy that you're finding success throughout the globe.
Yeah, that I can concur with. So for those of you who's listening to this that wants to go and Google Sophia, it is like it's not Sophia, it's SFIA, Skills Framework for the Information Age.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like your new appointee, Matthew, in the American market is doing some good stuff.
Yeah.
So kudos to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So let's. I know that you're passionate about standards, but let's cast the net a little bit broader. Okay. We said, is best practice for us?
Mm-hmm.
How do we know? How do we know it's not just busy work?
Yeah. You know, that's been the age-old question since day one, hasn't it? It's like, how do we know best practice is actually best for us? And you know, and it comes down to what is it that we're going to measure and where do we measure? So I immediately start thinking about one of the diagrams in the old idle volumes that was just that waterfall, vision, mission, goals, objectives, CSFs, KPIs, metrics, and measurements, I think was the bottom. And it waterfalled down and then waterfalled up. And, it made the most sense other than the fact that it had 8 steps, which I thought was overkill, but that's okay. It's the fact of what we're doing, does it have an impact to the organization? So is the organization allowed to meet its vision, mission, goals, objectives, purpose, whatever you want to call it? Has it had a positive impact on the success of that purpose statement? Has it met the needs of our consumers? So 2 measures, that's all it is. Is best practice best for us? Well, ask your consumer and ask your organization and find a way to measure both. And then you'll know whether or not that you've chosen the right direction, or you've chosen the right controls on how you behave, something along that line. Can you go by gut feel? Well, your gut feel may be very different than your colleague or the director of IT or whoever it might be. You're going to have to find something that is qualitative, that people agree to. And this is something that I learned very early on in my consulting career as a service manager, is that I would sit down with the client, with the consumer, and very early on and say, what is it that you need to know that says you have benefit from X? And I remember spending a whole day with one client. I mean, over 8 hours. We never left the room. I mean, we carried in drinks, the whole thing. And at the end of the day, the guy's going, I can't believe you just spent an all day doing this. And I said, I was happy to do it. And he goes, and he says, okay, I'll trust you that it was the right thing to do. We started to measure the 8 or 10 measurements that we came up with at the very beginning and carried them on all through. And when the project ended, he sat down and he said, something that I learned is that you were absolutely right. We defined what it was that I needed to know that said we were successful and we're getting the bang for the buck of what that consultancy was about. And that I know whatever it is that we put in works and I'm happy with it. And so that's the kind of thing that I think has to happen today in a service management world. If it's best, decide what is that you have to see that will deliver the quantifiable evidence that you've achieved what you needed to achieve.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's about as generic as I can make it without, and I know there's a lot of esoterics in there, but that's exactly what you need to do.
Yeah, but it's interesting. As you were talking about this, I just realized that. So incidentally, for those of you who don't know, there's standards for writing standards also. That's why most of the management system standards look similar in structure.
Yeah.
And we always, we always start with what is the objectives of the organization. So what you've just described is essentially that. What is it that we're trying to do for our customer?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, not only for the customer, but also for ourselves. And I think that's the big piece.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I think that's a big piece that folks are starting to slowly get to. The statement, the customer is always right. I think that's 100% wrong. Yeah. It's like, no, this is where I love the standards piece, is that we work to consensus. It may not be what you want, but you can live with it. And I'm not saying that the customer is always wrong either. They have a point, but you have to dig to what that point is. It's not that they're just ticked off that they got charged an interest fee or whatever, but it's like, what is it that you like and don't like? And then come to that root cause of what it is, and then work on that point rather than getting caught up in that incident cycle. It's like, oh, I hate it. Well, your head's going to stop hurting when you stop hitting yourself. So
yeah. Hello, Amit. So slowly but surely people are starting to stick their heads out and just saying, oh, hello.
Yeah.
Okay, so we know how we would know. Okay, I won't repeat what Matthew just said. But it's something about customers. You can imagine.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. But the next question that we then need to ask is, if there's so many sets of guidance out there, how do you make sense of all of this?
Oh, good question. Actually, Mark Thomas and I wrote a book about it. And we actually had we had two editions of this book, and I have the cover on the wall over here. So, the pragmatic application of service management, or something close to that.
Okay.
And this is the something that I learned very quickly, and I think being an academic helped me in my consulting as a service manager. Being an academic, what do? You go out and collate just every bucket of information that you can possibly find to find what is available, what's known, what's not known, and then you go from there. And I applied the same principles, probably unconsciously, as I was working as a service manager. And of course, I started with idle. And then I came across and found 20,000 and COBIT and other frameworks or information sources. So, how do you know what's best and what's not best? I firmly believe, and this is what we wrote in the book, is that every new flavor of the day, I'm just going to use that, and I'm not using it as a derogatory statement, but every new flavor of the day gets developed because there's a gap in what's currently available. And so what happens is that you may have a set of information like idle, and then all of a sudden you have a gap in saying, well, what are we going to do about our consumer? And so then we go over and we look at something else to fill in that gap, which creates another gap. So these gaps become pervasive. And so we get all of this information. So what do you need to do? My whole career as a consultant, once I found 20,000, I learned idle first. I learned it very, very well. I think I could still repeat sections of the version 2 books from memory because it's just embedded. But as soon as I found 20,000 and I said, oh, here is a consolidated shot, Then I said, okay, what don't I understand, or what does idle COBIT bring to the table that allows me to be more successful in helping a client? Let me see what other people say. And then, you can't read everything that's out there. Idle has 1,500 pages, COBIT has 1,200 pages, the standard has 12. I'm going to start with 12 pages. I mean, honestly. So you have to pick and choose. You can't know everything. So find the ones that you feel most comfortable with and use those as resources. And if the suggestions that you can come up based on the 2 or 3 framework standards, methodologies, whatever that you have aren't being answered, go search someplace else. But you have to put a limit. You have to put a scope on it. And what's been the most successful in our industry? 20,000 idle and COBIT. Now, I'm not saying that the other ones aren't good, but those have been pervasive over time. And yes, there's a plethora of good ideas out there in other areas. You have to be selective and intelligent about how you go and pursue other information.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned a little bit earlier the difference between good practice and best practice. Can we've got like 5 minutes left. Can we quickly chat about emergent practice?
I think emergent practice is exactly that. We don't know if it's good or best yet until it's been tested. So to me, idle 4 is emergent.
Okay.
It's trying, I believe, and apologies to every idle 4 author out there, etc., or anybody that just lives and breathes idle. I was one of those people, but right now idle 4 is emergent. We don't know how it's going to impact the environment. We don't know how it's going to impact service management. Does it have good ideas? Absolutely. Does it have rotten ideas? Of course, everyone does. Every system does.
Yeah.
So emergent will become good or best as it's being used, and organizations that are using it have seen success to their purpose statement and to their consumers.
Yeah. And I think it becomes good and best by losing the nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I just thought about? I think he was a Greek playwright, Euripides. He said, question everything, learn something, and answer nothing.
Yes.
And I always wondered about that last one. Until the other day, I can't help myself. I have to write now. So I've just started writing on the next book. And I realized that answer nothing is not because you don't have an opinion. But the moment you think you have an opinion and you know what that truth is, then most probably you're wrong. Yeah. So
I think answer nothing is incredibly wise, because when you get to your reputation and you start making answers, people stop searching for alternatives of what fits. So answering nothing is a really important part in learning. Yes. That means you're still open, and that your mind is openly and actively engaged and looking for multiples of alternatives. As soon as you make an answer, all of a sudden you're set in stone. And we have to be careful with that in terms of what is it that we're answering. Is it something that can be set in stone, or are we actually curtailing maturity and innovation, perhaps?
Yeah. So let me in between quickly throw it out here. What do you think of this title? Gen X Manager, Overcoming Industrial Age Anti-Patterns and Surviving and Thriving in a Digital Age.
I would say no, just because of the length of it, and I didn't hear what the first 5 words were. So
you know that all of my book titles has got a title and a subtitle.
Yeah. So what's the exact title again? Say it again.
Yeah. The
you
Idiot
said genetics?
Gen X. No, the Idiot.
No,
Gen
the Idiot's
X
Guide.
Manager. No, the Idiot Gen X Manager.
Oh gosh. Okay. I would pick it up and say,
people like me.
Yeah. Okay, I would say go for it and see what happens.
Yeah.
I need to see it in writing. Unfortunately, I'm one of those that I'm not quite sure I have exactly all the words, so I need to see it in writing. So, but I would say go for it. It looks like it's snappy.
Yeah, well, at least it keeps me busy.
Yes, keeps you out of trouble, which you need.
Keeps me out of trouble. Yeah. Anyway, so we're up for an hour.
Yep.
Apologies for those of you who've missed the first 5 minutes. I started and then it stopped for some reason, and it took me 2 or 3 minutes to realize that. Suzanne, once again, thank you for making time to chat with me. It's always such a pleasure. And I always have tons of fun.
Yeah,
so
it's my pleasure.
I know that you
completely.
will be back next year, and also be back next year for my next class at Nelson Mandela.
You bet.
So
my pleasure.
Then it will be the third year as a guest lecturer for the course.
I'd be happy to do it.
So what remains is just for me to do all the closing off stuff. If you enjoyed our chat and you want to have a conversation with Suzanne, there's a contact detail. I know that she always loves chatting to people, and if she can, she'll rope you into the work group.
Yeah, absolutely.
So by all means, if you feel that you've got something to say, put your hand up. And then lastly, just a quick reminder that the gosh, I can't say digital transformation. So here's the thing. Last year, we published this book on competing in a digital future. Luckily, I didn't say digital transformation, because I agree with you. It's actually become a little bit trite.
Right.
Trite, yes. There is no such thing as digital transformation. Digital doesn't transform. Organizations do. But one of the steps in the Blue Book is now also available, and it's called Out Innovate the Competition. So if you're looking for a fast way of coming up with brilliant ideas that you will know will work within a week, maybe do a browse for that one also. The Blue Book is on Amazon. The Purple Book is not. I'm still fighting with them for some reason, because there's some of my content of the Blue Book in the Purple Book, and now they say it's plagiarism. Can you believe it? Anyway, so you can buy it on Barnes & Noble.
Yeah.
Suzanne, thank you. It was awesome chatting to you. Talk soon, and I hope to see you soon also.
Yeah, you bet. Cheers for now, pal. Thank you so very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.